Right now, we are at such a heightened escalatory cycle that really all red lines seem to be gone. So we don't have an ability to predict as well as we did in the past because we're in new territory. We are in really new territory right now.
Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast for the foreign policy and global development communities and anyone who wants a deeper understanding of what is driving events in the world today. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg. I am a veteran international affairs journalist and the editor of UN Dispatch. Enjoy the show. When I spoke with Dalia Dassa Kaye back in early November 2023, she more or less predicted the escalatory cycle that is currently unfolding between Israel, Hezbollah, and Iran. In our conversation nearly a year ago, she explained the dynamics that might lead a contained conflict in Gaza to a wider war between Israel and Iran that could potentially drag in the United States. Needless to say, events over the last several weeks are unfolding in ways that she predicted. So I wanted to have her back on the show today to explain why the logic of escalation has taken hold and where this conflict might be headed next. Dalia Dassa Kaye is a senior fellow at the UCLA Burkle Center for International Relations. She is also out with a brand new piece in Foreign Affairs that covers some of the same ground we discussed today. I'll post a link to it in the show notes of this episode. As always, please feel free to reach out to me using the contact button on globaldispatches.org. Also, if you're able, we would so love if you could become a paid supporter of Global Dispatches. Help keep the lights on around here. We appreciate it. Just go to globaldispatches.org and purchase a subscription via our Substack. If you can do it, I thank you so much. It's really helpful. And again, I'll post a link to that too in the show notes. Now here is my conversation with Dalia Dassa Kaye of the UCLA Burkle Center for International Relations. Dalia, thank you so much for joining me. I just wanted to acknowledge off the bat that we spoke November 3rd of last year, and frankly, you more or less predicted the escalatory cycle that we find ourselves in right now.
Well, nice to be with you again, Mark, and I'm sorry that my predictions are panning out. It is not a good situation, so it would be better to be wrong in this case.
And recalling the context back then in like less than a month, say, after the October 7th attacks, like what led you to predict this particular escalatory cycle that we are now in the midst of?
Well, look, it wasn't an exact prediction, but I don't think
it was pretty close. I will acknowledge it. Yeah.
Thank you. I mean, I think it was a concern that many had, that even in the early days and weeks of the war of Gaza, that when this war would continue, it was very easy to see how it would be difficult to contain over time. Biden administration, one of its highest priorities was to contain this conflict. But let's face it, it's been many months now since this has been a regional conflict. There were, I think, two main concerns here about why there was always this risk of this evolving, not just into this wider regional conflict spilling over into all various borders around Israel, but that it could evolve into a direct Israel-Iran escalation. And one is because of the ongoing risk of miscalculation. And we saw this in the April exchange between Israel and Iran, the first direct Iranian attack on Israel, and after over a decade of so-called shadow war. And in that case, Israel miscalculated. Israel wasn't looking to go for kind of a full-fledged conflict with Iran. It thought that its attack in Damascus on April 1st would not necessarily lead to a broad response from Iran, but miscalculated, and it did. And that conflict was contained. But that was an example where kind of tit-for-tat attacks within the broader context of the war in Gaza ongoing could lead each side to miscalculate the other, lead to an attack that went further than the other side expected, and then that would escalate into direct conflict. So that was one path that was always a worry. And then the other one was that, calculations could change, that basically one of the major players could decide that refraining from war was more risky than going kind of full-fledged into a conflict. And that seems to be where we're at now in terms of Israel's decision to fully take on Hezbollah. And many Israeli leaders, and this is across the political spectrum, have long looked at Iran as the source of their problems behind Hamas, behind Hezbollah. And so the idea is, to use Naftali Bennett's famous phrasing, the octopus strategy, kind of the idea of you got to get to the head of the octopus, not just the tentacles. And so there was this concern that at some point, Israel would see the need to fully take on Iran to really reduce the threats it's facing.
So can I ask you, because you just alluded to this, so for most of the last year, there has been this like tit for tat between Hezbollah and Israel in particular. And that tit for tat had more or less been constrained to a so-called like rules of the game, right? Yet something happened, and I'd love for you to identify what that made that tit for tat escalate very sharply. What's your explanation for why that Hezbollah Israel part of the conflict escalated so sharply and escalated sharply when it did at the tail end of this summer?
Yeah, the timing is trickier to really understand. I think it is important to recognize that the Hezbollah Israeli conflict was always going to be the front that was put the risk of a direct Israel Iran war, I think, was the most concerning risk.
Like you and pretty much every like regional scholar has said
Right.
that ad nauseum since the start of
Yes,
the Gaza conflict. Yeah.
exactly. Because Hezbollah is Iran's closest regional partner in the Axis, most ideologically aligned, really were created by the Iranians in the early 80s. So, the degradation of Hezbollah, it was really, everyone uses the crown jewel term, but it really was the most important deterrence aspect for the Iranians in terms of keeping the Israelis off their own territory, because that is Iran's ultimate aim, is to keep the fight out of Iran. So Hezbollah was really crucial. So this kind of back and forth since the October war started with Hezbollah going into it, not as far as Hamas would have liked. So Hezbollah did start attacks across the border, attacking northern Israel on October 8th, the day after the horrific Hamas attacks on the 7th. And Hamas was hoping and wanting a much more full-fledged cross-border multi-front attack on Israel from those early days. That did not happen. And so Hezbollah did enter the fight, but in a way, as you said, that kind of more or less pushed the limits on the rules, but stayed within the border region. So there was this kind of sense that there were certain rules of engagement that Israel and Hezbollah had developed since their end of their last war in 2006 that kept that border very tense, but there was kind of calculated, calibrated attacks that both sides thought could be contained and they could live with. But it was always a very risky situation. And as the war continued, each side started to kind of push the limits, go further within territory on their respective sides. More civilians started to be killed. The timing over the summer, I think several things developed. One is there was an attack. This kind of gets to the miscalculation, probably not intended by Hezbollah, but nonetheless resulted in civilian deaths in the Golan of a number of Druze on a soccer field. That really kind of emphasized the threat that this cross-border stuff could lead to. But then, of course, you had the late July killing of Hania in Tehran, along with Shukr, a very senior commander of Hezbollah. That really started to signal that the Israelis were changing their calculus, that Iran's attempt in April to so-called change the equation by hitting Israel directly, to say, okay, Israel, you can't just keep degrading us and Hezbollah with no repercussions, obviously did not work, because Israel was not deterred and decided it would continue to do this. Then you have the interesting pager and walkie-talkie attacks.
Yes, please explain those in the context of your sort of research, your study of escalatory cycles, because there was something just like audacious about those attacks that really seemed to, from my perspective, like triggered this current cycle that we're in.
It did in a way, although it's unclear, and that's why I don't want to be too definitive about it. There's no question it was bold, and Nasrallah was still alive at the time, actually declared that this crossed all red lines, right? That there were no red lines anymore. Everything was on the table now. So going after in such an overt way, right? No more of this shadow war behind the scenes, but like on, a direct pummeling of this organization, showing extensive Israeli intelligence reach, which, by the way, the Hania killing in Tehran also showed, because it was a very
Yeah.
targeted attack in an Iranian government building the week of the Iranian president's inauguration. So these were very provocative attacks. And so there's no question that it was signaling that everything's possible, everything's on the table now. The one thing, though, that gives me pause about that in terms of whether that was intentionally the moment that was supposed to trigger this bigger escalation is that, this no doubt was, and we know these kinds of extensive operations are planned for years. So there were reports at the time that Israel faced kind of a lose it or use it situation where perhaps Hezbollah operatives became aware that Israel had penetrated its communication system. And therefore, the Israelis were kind of faced with this choice of
Mm,
either we go forward with this operation now or we lose the opportunity of
I
this
see.
tactical military win. So there was that sense that it could have just been random timing. And then they just figured, let's
Mm.
capitalize on it. It's an interesting question that we won't know for probably many years. I think it's ultimately, though, a tactical question. I think we need to step back and look at the bigger strategic picture, which is that Israeli calculations did change. And there was a decision that we, Israel, can no longer live with this threat on our border, that containment and management of these threats, like Hezbollah, are not acceptable. And in fact, you had Israeli leaders who argued this from the very beginning of the Gaza conflict. Defense Minister Galat wanted to go north right away. There were big decisions around that first week after the attacks on October 7th, where Israel came very close to taking on a second front, taking on Hezbollah in the early weeks of the war. It decided not to ultimately. And Netanyahu may have been cautious then. They had enough to deal with, obviously, in Gaza, as we see to this day. So there is no question Israel had its sights on taking on Hezbollah more forcefully, and Iran for that matter. But the timing is still very uncertain. But there is a sense that things were changing over the summer, even before the pager attacks, that as the war was kind of, I wouldn't say wrapping up in Gaza, but that it kind of reached a stalemate, that there was a strategic and if not political motivation to start turning attention north.
Do you think at this point, and we're speaking Friday, October 4th, that Israel firmly has the upper hand? You've seen the pager attacks, which were, audacious. You've seen the targeted strikes in Tehran, in Damascus, the assassination of Nasrallah, the ability to absorb ballistic missile attacks from Iran, and really like muted response thus far, it would seem, from Hezbollah. So from that perspective, it seems that these like hawkish Israeli military officials, like Defense Minister Gallant, maybe they were right all along.
Well, a few things. Let's acknowledge, yes, Israel has had really major tactical military successes in the last couple months and weeks, especially. The Nasrallah killing was the most transformational of that list, but Israel has been degrading Hezbollah since October 7th. I think people forget that context, that this has been an ongoing assault over the entire year. But this current escalation does show Israel's so-called escalation dominance. It has been very successful. Its penetration into Hezbollah and Iranian intelligence and communications is extensive and has been shown and demonstrated. So this is definitely a tactical win in that sense. And Israel, compared to the situation in Gaza with Hamas, much more contentious. There's a lot more consensus in Israel on this front. And Israel's been preparing for fighting Hezbollah since 2006. So there's a lot of years of preparation for this fight. So they're much better positioned. All of that said, I would be very, and not just me, I think Israelis themselves in the defense and security establishment, while there is a sense of kind of exuberance and triumphalism, and they understand that they have had success, there is also an understanding that this comes with costs and that the story is not over and these are still very serious adversaries. So, for example, yes, Hezbollah is degraded. Nasrallah's killing was huge, a huge blow to the organization.
Can I just ask you to explain why the decapitation strike that took out Nasrallah was so profound? Because why can't, say, Hezbollah just appoint a new leader, maybe like a younger, more hot-headed one than Nasrallah?
Right, right, which they in fact are in the process of doing, although, and news reports are still incoming, Israel is attempted to just assassinate the successor. I
Well, there
think
you
they might
go.
have succeeded. So yes, this is exactly the strategy. They will come up with a new one and Israel will continue this cycle and they'll continue to target and assassinate. Everybody is at risk. But Nasrallah was the leader who shaped Hezbollah from the start, led it into more than just this so-called resistance group within Hezbollah, but really this charismatic leader that had power throughout the region as one of the main Arab leaders of this non-state militia group that successfully stood up to Israel. So in 2006, it didn't decisively win the war, but it didn't lose it. And it was viewed as a very big victory against Israel. And their ongoing attacks and the ongoing pressure that they have caused in Israel's north was viewed before this current degradation as one of the most potent forces that has been able to fight Israel, far more than Iran itself. So Hezbollah had a reach beyond Lebanon, and he was viewed, especially since Soleimani, the head of the IRGC, the Iranian military wing,
who the U.S. Killed in the
U.S.
tail end
killed
of the Trump
in
administration, yes.
Yes, in late 2020. And so Nasrallah was also viewed as a very important player and leader in kind of keeping this Iranian so-called axis of resistance groups, these groups, loosely aligned groups of Hezbollah, the militia forces in Iraq, the Houthis in Yemen. It's a decentralized network, but somebody needs to coordinate among them. And Soleimani had played that role in the past. Nasrallah, since Soleimani's death, was viewed as a very instrumental leader of this axis. So his death was a big deal. I don't think we should underestimate that. And Hezbollah has certainly taken big hits. But the point I was trying to make is, the story is not over. Now that Israel has followed up with Nasrallah's killing with a ground invasion, Israel already has faced 8 casualties. IDF soldiers on the ground were killed already. I think another 2 might have been killed today in the Golan from Iraqi militia forces. So, yeah, you have a degraded axis, but you have a very angry remnants of this axis. And you have plenty of ammunition left for recruits, given the kind of destruction that's unfolding in Gaza, what's starting to unfold in Lebanon. So there's plenty of room for, I think, Israelis to be concerned. Despite its conventional superiority, those asymmetric threats are still very much there. And then on the Iran missile attack, definitely was ineffective, right? No casualties in Israel. Damage seems to be limited. But the fact, and Israelis, when I was in Israel in late June, early July, they would say the April 1st attack was also ineffective, but security folks there were not just thinking, okay, now we, kind of they rolled over, they're done. They were saying the fact that the Iranians even were bold enough to launch it and took those risks means that deterrence is not working. So the fact that the Iranians took a risk at this point, and it was a risky move to directly attack Israel in this context of having killed Nasrallah, degraded Hezbollah, Iran is incredibly vulnerable right now, and they still took this risk. Yes, it was ineffective this time, but we don't have the full assessment yet. And the fact of the matter is the Iranians seem to have targeted 3 military bases, well, 1 intelligence headquarters, that were inaccurate missiles. But if they chose to launch another attack in the central of very populated areas of Tel Aviv, even if they were inaccurate, it could lead to a lot of casualties because the early assessments are suggesting that actually a number of these missiles, possibly up to 30 or so, did hit Israel. They did Those who are in the camp of saying, this is the time, hit Iran hard, they're really vulnerable, this is the time to just kind of really go full force. I think we really need to be cautious here because the ability of Iran itself and even these forces in the Axis are still very active and can cause a lot of damage even as they're degraded.
Well, I mean, that camp in like the Israeli decision making, the ones that do want to hit back and hit back hard, seem to be the ones calling the shots right now.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, what would a potential escalatory cycle look like from here? I mean, could we see Israel strike, say, Iranian nuclear facilities? Could we see Israel go so far as to like do a decapitation strike against the Ayatollah? Like, where does this end? And where might this lead from here? What's your assessment, having studied how these escalatory cycles work, of what might be just like the most extreme, frankly, at this point?
Well, I think really one point that's really important for your listeners is that you can study past escalatory cycles and try to predict. But one thing we know about escalation cycles is it comes with a lot of uncertainty. These are really dangerous games. And so anybody who says they can fully predict how this will end, I don't think, it really should be taken
Well, I'm asking you to
seriously.
predict this because, like, about a year ago, you predicted where we are at right now. So
Well, that was
I'm
maybe by
nudging
chance,
you.
let me say. I mean, look, of course, there are things more within the realm of reality and less within the realm, but I think it is important to understand we don't know because right now we are at such a heightened escalatory cycle that really all red lines seem to be gone. So we don't have an ability to predict as well as we did in the past because we're in new territory. We are in really new territory right now. Obviously, there is a menu out there of what the Israelis could do in response. And given the kind of psyche in Israel right now, where they don't feel post October 7th that they can live with these threats, and also following all of these tactical military wins that they feel they have gained against both Iran and definitely against Hezbollah. There are those, as you say, in Israel who would likely be pushing to go very far, which could include attacking nuclear sites, could go as far as trying to target not just IRGC commanders, but political leaders within Iran. I mean, anything is on the table. But there's also the potential of the Israelis kind of looking at the situation and saying, maybe we should close this round for now, take the win, so to speak, and focus on just kind of continuing to degrade Hezbollah and push them back from the border now that we're on the ground. So there is also the possibility that the Israelis, they'll likely want to do more than they did in April, but they could launch an attack that's along those lines where it still sticks to military sites in
Hmm.
Iran. Probably missile launch sites would be most proportionate in terms of responding to a missile attack from Iran. And that's what they did in April, but maybe it would be more expansive and more sites targeted, but that they would stop short of attacking nuclear sites.
Hmm.
I think that is a possibility. That's likely what the Americans are strongly advising and encouraging. But I think the track record of the last year shows that ultimately the Israelis are going to do what they want to do and don't feel they have many constraints.
So, lastly, what are the circumstances that you could foresee might drag the United States more deeply into potentially a direct conflict with Iran? Given, of course, the U.S. has been trading fire with Iran proxies, but is there any circumstance you might foresee that could drag American forces in direct conflict with Iran?
I think this is a real risk. And I think, we shouldn't be alarmist, but we have to be realistic that there are a number of scenarios that could most definitely involve the US more than the US is already involved. Let's also acknowledge the US has already been assisting Israel in fending off these missile attacks. So the US is already in this war, but it could be involved much more significantly in a few ways. One is the Americans are already vulnerable to attacks from Iranian aligned militia forces, especially from Iraq, that have threatened to retaliate against Americans if they join the Israelis in a counterattack. But also, it depends on how Israel responds to the missile barrage it just faced. And if Israel goes after nuclear sites, that would be more likely to lead to an Iranian response. And if the Iranians decide to up the escalation ladder and start targeting civilian sites within Israel or infrastructure. And you have large number of Israeli civilians killed or in harm's way, it's hard to see the United States not coming in very forcefully to defend Israel. The other is if Israel targets infrastructure within Iran. That's another possibility. A lot of folks are talking about the possibility of oil sites getting targeted, ports, other infrastructure within Iran. That would move Israel into the realm of not just being in a fight against the Islamic Republic, but against the Iranian state itself. That would lead to no question serious escalation. The Iranians have already threatened if their oil facilities are hit, that they would hit oil facilities in the Gulf, and the U.S. has forces stationed in many of these Gulf states. So it's hard to see the U.S. not getting involved under that kind of scenario. So unfortunately, many of these escalatory possibilities will involve the United States, which is why I think, again, we see the Biden administration so concerned about this war spilling beyond Gaza. And sadly, a year into this very, very cruel and brutal war, we are there. It's not hypothetical anymore.
Well, Dalia, thank you so much for your time. This was really helpful.
Thank you, Mark. Great to be with you.
Thanks for listening to Global Dispatches. The show is produced by me, Mark Leon Goldberg. It is edited and mixed by Levi Sharp. If you are listening on Apple Podcasts, make sure to follow the show and enable automatic downloads to get new episodes as soon as they're released. On Spotify, tap the bell icon to get a notification when we publish new episodes. And of course, please visit globaldispatches.org to get on our free mailing list, get in touch with me, and access our full archive. Thank you.